During a lecture at NYU Stern, an assistant professor mocked Donald Trump's business practices, leaving the entire class stunned. The lecture hall was packed, students poised with notebooks and laptops, ready for another intense economics discussion. Assistant Professor Riley, known for her sharp tongue and unapologetic critiques, wasted no time diving into the topic. Belief in business. Her voice carried effortlessly across the room, capturing the class's full attention. She began broadly, discussing mismanagement and corporate greed, but soon took a more personal turn. "Let's talk about Donald Trump," she said, a sly smile creeping onto her face. "A so-called billionaire whose strategies are as shaky as his comb-over." Chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they quickly faded as she pressed on. She criticized his real estate ventures, calling them overinflated failures, and dismissed his leadership style as pure narcissism. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students glanced around uncomfortably, while others stifled nervous laughter. But in the middle of the front row sat Barron Trump. He was quiet, his face calm, betraying none of the emotions that must have been simmering beneath the surface. A slight tightening of his jaw and a quick glance down at his notebook were the only signs he was affected. As Professor Riley continued, students whispered to each other, clearly uneasy. Everyone knew who was sitting there, but no one dared to look directly at him. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Professor Riley's critiques escalated, her voice growing sharper with each pointed remark. "And let's not forget his so-called art of the deal," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A masterclass in how to overpromise and underdeliver." Her laser focus shifted to one of Trump's more controversial financial decisions, a high-profile project that ended in bankruptcy. She dissected it line by line, highlighting every misstep. "This is what you don't do if you want to succeed in business," she declared, her words punctuated by a hard tap of her pen on the podium. The room grew quieter. The scattered laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by an awkward tension. Students fidgeted in their seats, casting uneasy glances at Barron. They weren't sure whether to admire his composure or feel second-hand embarrassment on his behalf. A few were visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their chairs as the professor's jabs became more personal. Barron remained still, his hands resting on his notebook. His expression was unreadable, but his body language betrayed subtle signs of discomfort, a slight clench of his fist, a brief tightening of his lips. He stared at the professor intently, as if analyzing her every word. Professor Riley, perhaps emboldened by his silence, pressed on. "What's truly astonishing," she continued, "is how someone can fail so spectacularly and still brand themselves as a success. It's a testament to the power of spin over substance." The classroom was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. A few students dared to glance at Barron again, as if gauging whether he would react. Some seemed to silently plead for him to stay quiet, while others leaned forward, curious to see if he would defend his father. And then it happened. Barron shifted in his seat and raised his hand. The movement was small but significant. The tension tightened as every pair of eyes turned to him, and the room collectively held its breath. Even Professor Riley paused mid-sentence, clearly caught off guard. "Yes?" she asked, her voice measured but tinged with surprise. Barron paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Then he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the desk, and continued. "There's something else I'd like to share, if that's okay," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of confidence. Professor Riley nodded, her expression unreadable, as if bracing for whatever he might say next. "My father taught me something else about success," Barron said, his voice steady. "He taught me that behind every achievement, there's a team of people who made it possible. It's not just about one person. It's about everyone who contributed, who believed in the vision, even when things seemed impossible." He glanced briefly around the room, his gaze sweeping over his classmates before returning to the professor. "That's something I've seen firsthand. Hard work, dedication, resilience. Those are the values he instilled in us, and those are the things I try to live by." A few students shifted in their seats, their expressions softening. Barron's words were striking, not just because of their content, but because of the sincerity with which they were delivered. He wasn't defending his father out of blind loyalty. He was speaking from a place of genuine understanding and personal conviction. He then pivoted, his tone thoughtful. I believe that public figures like my father are open to criticism, and they should be. Criticism is part of accountability. But I think there's a difference between constructive criticism and using someone as a scapegoat for everything we think is wrong with the world. No one is perfect, and no one achieves anything alone. I think it's important to consider both, the flaws and the strengths in people, especially when we're in a position to influence how others see them. The classroom was still, the atmosphere charged with a mix of emotions. Barron's words didn't just challenge the professor. They challenged everyone in the room to think more deeply about their own perspectives. Professor Riley's expression softened. She set down her pen and stepped out from behind the podium. You make a fair point, she admitted, her voice quieter. Now, perhaps I was too harsh in my assessment. It's easy to focus on the negative, especially when discussing someone as polarizing as your father. But you've reminded me that there's more to every story than just the headlines. Barron nodded, his expression still calm. Thank you for hearing me out, he said. The professor hesitated for a moment, then added, and thank you for speaking up. It takes courage to do what you just did. For the first time that day, a small ripple of applause broke out in the lecture hall. It wasn't loud or exuberant, but it carried a weight of its own, a quiet acknowledgement of Barron's poise and grace. The room was still buzzing with the aftermath of Barron's calm but powerful response as the professor turned back to the podium. She glanced at him one more time, her usual sharp confidence tempered by something else. Respect. Barron sat back in his seat, his demeanor composed, but his impact lingered heavily over the room. It was then that Barron did something unexpected. He raised his hand again. The professor paused, waiting for him to continue. There's one more thing I want to say, he began, his voice steady but laced with a subtle warmth. I'm here as a student just like everyone else. I'm here to learn, to grow, and to understand perspectives that are different from my own. And I want to thank you, Professor Riley, for challenging us. It's through these kinds of conversations that we find clarity, even if it's uncomfortable. The tension in the room eased slightly as students exchanged glances. Some smiled faintly. Others nodded. Barron's humility was disarming, breaking through the walls of defensiveness and preconceptions that had hung over the discussion. Professor E. Riley seemed caught off guard again, but this time her response was softer. You're right, she said, her tone more measured now. Discomfort is where learning begins. I hope you all take that lesson to heart, not just about this discussion, but in life. As she turned back to the whiteboard, the lecture resumed, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Students who had been nervously silent now felt emboldened to participate, asking questions and debating ideas with a renewed sense of openness. Barron remained engaged, but let others take the lead, quietly observing the discussion as it unfolded. By the time the class ended, the usual shuffle of students packing up their belongings felt different, as if no one wanted to break the spell of what had just transpired. Barron stood, gathering his notebook, when a fellow student approached him cautiously. Hey, she said, her voice soft. I just wanted to say that what you said earlier, it really resonated with me. I think a lot of us needed to hear that. Barron offered a gentle smile. Thank you. I think it's important to remember that there's more to every story than what we see on the surface. As more students gathered around him, offering quiet words of support, or simply standing in solidarity, Barron's quiet grace left an indelible mark. Even those who didn't speak to him directly couldn't deny the ripple effect of his words. Outside the classroom, Professor Riley stood by the door, watching as her students left. When Barron passed, she gave him a small nod. Thank you, Barron, she said simply. For what? He asked, his expression genuinely curious. For reminding me that even teachers still have a lot to learn, she replied. As Barron stepped out of the lecture hall, the echoes of the conversation still lingered in his mind. He wasn't one to seek attention, but the quiet acceptance from his classmates left him reflecting on what had just happened. For a brief moment, he paused in the hallway, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder. The hum of student chatter filled the corridor, yet a few faces turned his way, offering small nods or quick words of encouragement. "Hey, Barron," a male student called out, jogging to catch up with him. "That was impressive, man. Not many people could have handled that the way you did." Barron shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I just said what I felt needed to be said." The student chuckled, shaking his head. "Still, it takes guts. Thanks for standing up like that." He clapped Barron on the shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. As Barron walked toward the campus courtyard, he felt the weight of the moment begin to lift. The crisp autumn air greeted him, and he breathed it in deeply, letting the tension ease from his chest. He found a quiet bench beneath a large oak tree, the shade offering a small escape from the buzz of campus life. As he sat there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his mother. "Heard about your class today. Proud of you." A small smile broke across his face as he read the words. He typed back a quick reply before setting the phone aside. Just as he began to relax, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Professor Riley standing a few feet away, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a binder in the other. Her expression was thoughtful, almost hesitant. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" she asked. "Of course," Barron replied. Gesturing to the empty spot on the bench beside her, she sat down, taking a sip of her coffee before speaking. "You know, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times a student has challenged me like that, in a respectful way, I mean." Barron shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I wasn't trying to challenge you, Professor. I just thought the conversation could use a little balance." Riley chuckled softly, nodding. "And that's exactly why it stood out. You didn't come at me with anger or defensiveness. You spoke with clarity and confidence. That's rare, especially nowadays." She paused, her gaze drifting out toward the courtyard. "I wanted to thank you for that. You reminded me of something important today, that our words carry weight, and that it's easy to forget the human element behind every critique." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think we all need that reminder sometimes, myself included." The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of campus life carrying on around them. After a few moments, Professor Riley turned back to Barron. "You know," she began, her voice softer now, "it's easy to stand at a podium and deliver opinions, especially when you're removed from the people those opinions might affect. Today, you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, to foster meaningful dialogue, not just deliver my perspective." Barron glanced at her, his expression warm. "I think it's important to have those discussions, even if they're uncomfortable. But it's also important to listen. That's something my dad always taught me. You don't have to agree with everyone, but you should try to understand where they're coming from." Riley nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the courtyard as students passed by. "It's good advice," she said. "And for what it's worth, I'll be rethinking how I approach certain topics in the future. Today wasn't just a lesson for the students. It was one for me, too." Barron smiled faintly, appreciating her humility. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." She stood, adjusting the binder under her arm. "Well, I should get going, but I wanted you to know that what you said today, it mattered." "Thank you, Professor," Barron replied, standing as well, "and thank you for giving me the chance to speak." As she walked away, Barron remained by the bench for a moment, watching the campus bustle around him. A sense of quiet pride settled over him, not for defending his father, but for the way the conversation had shifted from conflict to understanding. The ripples of that moment carried through the day. By evening, a few classmates reached out to Barron, thanking him for what he'd said. Some even admitted they had misjudged him before, seeing him only as the son of a controversial figure. Now they saw someone who was thoughtful, composed, and willing to stand up for his beliefs without tearing anyone down. For Barron, the day wasn't about changing minds. It was about planting a seed. And as he packed his books for the next day, He hoped that seed would grow into something bigger, a reminder to always seek understanding, even in the face of criticism.